We are live for episode 92 of Trek Live. Um, how you doing this morning, Bill?
Doing really good.
Yep.
Happy to be here. 2 weeks in a row. Uh, just glad to be back in like the rhythm of doing this every week. So excited to talk about some TNG today.
Yeah, I know. I'm excited to be back too on a kind of weekly basis, getting back into the rhythm. I'm especially excited today because we are going to be jumping into some TNG. I think it works out perfectly because we're both kind of either just hitting in our rewatch or just watching our rewatch. So I think it's gonna make for a really fun conversation.
Yeah, it's a show that's definitely, I think, both. It's on both of our minds
Yes.
because the recency for both of us. And this is a unique topic. I don't know that I've seen people uh, cover this. Yeah, I could be wrong. Maybe somebody has.
Yeah.
But really looking forward to talking about how Encounter at Farpoint and All Good Things kind of bookend the show and how it impacts uh, the show as a whole. Um, how it maybe gives the show, gives the audience some interesting things to think about when they're watching the show, especially on second time, third time through it, when you know what the bookending um, framing device sort of is.
Right.
Uh,
Yep.
but before we get into all that, where are you in your rewatch? Have you watched any new, or not new, but have you gone back to any TOS episodes this week since the last time we did this?
Yeah, I'm not sure where we were. My last episode that I watched was where No Man Has Gone Before.
Okay.
Um, yeah. So I finished that, and then my next on the ticket is the Naked Time. So I kind of taking it a little slow,
Mm-hmm.
especially when I'm transitioning from TNG to TOS. But I'm excited to kind of get into a rhythm with that. But
Mm-hmm.
yes,
Cool.
yep. What about you?
I watched Data Lore last night, which is the only one I've watched, I think, since we did this
Okay.
last weekend. I'm hoping to watch a couple more today.
Mm-hmm.
But Data Lore is an interesting one. It falls into the trap of early TNG season one, where something I think we may have covered this on the show before, but I feel like the biggest issue with Wesley Crusher's character comes down to like the way they treat him early in season one, where he in episodes like Data Lore is sort of the only character who's wily enough and onto the clues enough to kind of solve the problem ahead of like the trained career officers.
Yeah.
You know, he's onto the Data Lore swap much faster than the experienced crew that work side by side with Data every day,
Yes.
um, which is, I think hurts the episode a little bit, but more in a big picture sense, I think is a big part of what gave the Wesley character problems early on and made people resist the idea of having this kid on the ship.
That knew more than everyone.
When I think it grated on people's nerves that Wesley is seemingly solving a lot of these problems and seems to be smarter than anybody else on the ship, which I wish they would have taken a different approach with the character and not done that, because I think there is potential with that character if you take a different tact. And I think in a little bit later in the show, I think in like season 2, for example, when the writing is a little bit better and
Right.
maybe they've learned from these mistakes. They're not falling into these traps quite as often. There are episodes like Pen Pals later on where Wesley is the Wesley story isn't like this story in Data Lore, where he's kind of onto the mystery and solving the problem. He's a young person who's put in this position where he has to work with other people and learn how to be younger than people you're supervising, and learning how to be a leader, getting advice from people like Riker and Troy. And that, to me, that's like the right direction to take a character like Wesley Crusher. But unfortunately, they don't really get there and don't do it consistently until maybe it's a little too late, uh, and after too much damage has been done. So it's something that always kind of hits me when I do TNG like this early in the show. And it's kind of a shame. But Data Lore has a lot of cool stuff in it. It's got some cool imagery with the crystalline entity and
Yeah.
some cool camera work with Brent Spiner playing two characters. I think Spiner's really, really good. I think it's the first time that Spiner's really, really good, and doing more than just kind of his early series quirky ticks as Data. He gets to stretch a little bit. So it's a really mixed bag of an episode. There's so many things in it I love. The performance from Brent Spiner and some of the visual stuff, some of the direction, the score is really good. But it's infuriating at the same time with the way it treats the characters. So it's kind of TNG season 1 in a nutshell. It's got some really redeeming, cute qualities to it, but it's really struggling with some of the writing. But next is Angel One, which is a whole new breath of fresh air, and I can't wait to do that. I haven't. It hasn't been that long since I watched it. We watched it as a part of one of our Trek After Dark watch party events. Yes. Really, really fun time. Hopefully we'll be doing it soon.
Yep.
Hopefully we won't be watching Angel 1 again at the next one. But
never know.
You never know. It could happen. It's never a bad time to watch Angel 1.
Nope.
But yeah, I'm looking forward to kind of diving back into it with a little bit more of a critical eye than I had that night when we were watching it. Kind of just going along for the ride with maybe a synthahol or two in me.
Yes.
Watching Angel 1 is probably the right way to go. But look for that hopefully today, and maybe one or two more on Twitter. So
cool.
TNG season 1.
Yes. With that being said, let's jump into the topic. Bill, since this is your kind of baby, in a nutshell, what are we kind of talking about today?
We're going to talk about how Encounter at Farpoint and All Good Things sort of build on each other, and how TNG, more than the other shows, I think, has that bookending quality to the premiere and the finale. There are certainly elements in really all of the shows, with the exception of TOS, which doesn't really have a proper finale the way that the other shows do. But they all have
6, but yeah,
6 maybe, is the closest thing they have to a proper finale.
Yeah.
But TNG, more than the other shows, has a story element, a specific thing that directly ties the premiere to the finale, and sort of brackets the series as a whole, more so than hammering home a theme or paying off a big overarching plot like Voyager did. Obviously, there's certainly a bookending nature there, but TNG, I think, has a very specific bookending nature that I'm interested in talking about. So
yeah, it should be fun. I see we just get into it.
Sure.
Yeah, a question right off the bat. Maybe we can kind of you kind of hit on just then. What makes it different than kind of the other shows? Because we kind of did see in Voyager, not a bookend to like TNG did, but there were definitely some bookend type qualities. Also with Deep Space Nine. What makes it different? What makes TNG different from the other shows, and how they use that kind of formula?
I think what makes TNG different is that it ties so specifically into the legitimate, plot of Encounter at Farpoint.
Right.
The way it ties back to like specific imagery from that episode. And I think the thing that impresses me the most about it, and that always kind of takes me by surprise, is that aside from some people in like the art department and people like the composer is connected both those episodes, the people who are making the show, Rick Berman is another common element, but the people who are writing the show on a daily basis, the people who are shooting it, the production design people, the costume designers, the editors, they're all completely different by the time All Good Things gets here than what the people who were producing Encounter at Farpoint. Right. So it's not like DS9, for example, where there's a lot of commonality. Ira Stephen Bear for Deep Space Nine is like a consistent presence from day one all the way to the end as the showrunner. So you could really see that sort of making sense if he had done something like Encounter at Farpoint to All Good Things, sort of does. But there's so little common DNA from Encounter at Farpoint to All Good Things. I think it's kind of amazing that the choice was made to go back to the first episode, in which people writing All Good Things had nothing to do with, to sort of um, tie everything up in a bow. Yeah. So to kind of get specific, obviously Encounter at Farpoint is kind of a two-pronged episode where they're dealing with this mystery at Farpoint Station, getting the crew together. It's a aspiring Federation, a species aspiring to become a part of the Federation, and there's this mystery going on at this station. There's some weird, supernatural kinds of things happening, things appearing out of nowhere, people getting exactly what they want, and nobody understands how that's possible. And obviously they unravel that mystery, but kind of overarching all of that is they come across Q, who decides he's going to put humanity on trial, and Picard's going to be sort of the proxy for humanity, to kind of decide if humanity has evolved enough from its barbaric, pre-spacefaring days to be out in space and exploring and putting itself in the position to influence other species and to keep pushing forward, basically. Right. And Picard has to defend humanity, and and All Good Things sort of brings back that trial idea. Yeah. Q reappears again, as he has throughout the show, but Picard's back in the courtroom, and at one point Q says, the trial never ends. They're continually on trial, and Picard's continuing to stand in, even though he doesn't really know it. And it's sort of implying, in my mind, that all of these adventures that we've seen up to this point, without Picard really realizing it, Q has been watching the whole time. Yeah. And there's this kind of so what makes it different, we'll get more into like the specifics of all that, and right. How it maybe impacts the way I look at TNG now that I've seen it many, many times, and I know the bookending nature of it. But the way that it ties into a specific plot element of the premiere, and not just like the overall premise of the show on a broader level, like Voyager. The log line of that series is ship gets removed from home, has to make its way back home, and of course, the end of the show, they get home. Spoiler alert. That's a clear arc for the show that's established from day one, that this is going to be what the show is. Right. Where TNG, and that it's exploring something that hasn't been present since the premiere in a obvious way.
Right. So maybe we could take a kind of deep dive into each episode specifically. What are your thoughts on Encounter at Farpoint?
Encounter at Farpoint, to me, having just watched it, I think it's kind of underrated. It's got a very 80s charm to it. There are things about it that certainly haven't aged very well, and it's a bit inconsistent. It's a bit clunky, but I think I think the story that I'm kind of talking about here is the bracketing element of TNG, bookending the show. It is the best thing about it. It kind of does set the tone for what Star Trek is and what Star Trek's going to be moving forward. It's about living this better life that Picard is sort of selling Q on, that the humanity's become. Humanity is not what it once was, and it's growing beyond the baser instincts that were problematic hundreds of years ago, that we're kind of dealing with now. I like that it confronts that in such a forward way. It takes it on head on, and kind of lays down the gauntlet for what the next generation is going to be getting at for the foreseeable future, and what Star Trek at its core is. And I think like Gene Roddenberry had become, from my perspective at least, and reading about him and watching people who knew him talk about him, and just having some idea of the history of Star Trek, by this point, Roddenberry maybe kind of bought into the big picture of Star Trek and what it means and what it's trying to say, maybe more so than he had in mind when they were making the original series. I think the aura and the mystique of Star Trek had built itself up to a point where it was kind of unavoidable, and Roddenberry decided to make it a part of the show in a more obvious way, in the Next Generation, and you see that in the pilot.
Yeah.
In TOS, it's sort of more subtle. It's kind of not something that they week in week out make a big. They're not beating you over the head, I don't think, with this idea of humanity has gotten better, humanity's moved beyond those things, that there's this big level of progress. It's certainly in the DNA of the show, but it's not something it's telling you. They're just showing it to you. Where TNG, I think, Encounter Farpoint makes a point to tell you that humanity has done these things. And I think that's a interesting way to start the show. I think it's kind of bold and an interesting way to like bring Trek back in its new form. So I love the Q Picard dynamic, the trial, the defending humanity. I think John Delancey and Patrick Stewart have chemistry right away, and I think that's what leads to this bookending nature. I think one of the best things about TNG is that Q Picard dynamic that comes in every so often. I think that's an easy win for the show. They know it's going to be good when they do it, which I think contributed to the idea of ending the show on that too.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's definitely underrated. Like you said, it definitely is a bold way to start out the show. It's really honest in that, like you said, this is what we're going to be about. And this is what the show is going to be about going forward. I love that they just go right out there and say it. I love this sci-fi concept of this elevated alien species that's putting us on trial. I think that it's really big. I feel like you need a kind of a big concept to kind of start out this show. It feels very high stakes. Like it's not. I like that it does feel high stakes, but there's also some like smaller elements that we can kind of relate to with Farpoint Station and stuff like that.
Real quick, I think. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
You go first. No, what I was going to say was I think you're dead on, and I think the most fascinating thing about that idea is if you read about the making of TNG and the making of Encounter Farpoint. Originally, the episode was supposed to be an hour long, and it was just the Farpoint mystery. And when the network and Paramount wanted to make it 2 hours, the way that Roddenberry kind of stretched the episode was by introducing Q. Like that was sort of the afterthought. That was sort of the thing that he threw in to stretch the episode out and give it another element. So the fact that, like you said, it's the thing that gives the episode the real high stakes. It's the thing that feels big enough to reintroduce the show and give the show some scope and some gravitas in its premiere, as like this is Star Trek coming back to the small screen and reintroducing it as its new thing, not Kirk, Spock, McCoy. Like it's this big enough story that sort of sells that idea, was sort of an afterthought and something that wasn't originally conceived as a part of the introduction to the show. It's kind of an interesting side note that it was an afterthought, and it is the thing that I think is most successful about the episode.
Yeah, that's
and it's ultimately the thing that it leads to all the way to the end of the show.
Right, exactly. There's not a lot of times where I'm kind of supporting maybe show executives, but I think that was the right call to make, especially when you kind of look at maybe modern Trek now, and how did they open Discovery with this big high stakes battle between Federation and the Klingons. So I think it's just cool to see that in this episode, and that's one of the things. That's probably the thing I love most about Encounter at Farpoint, is this big stakes feeling. Now we kind of fast forward 7 years, all good things. Thoughts?
I mean, I've always kind of said I think it's one of the better. It's certainly the best Star Trek series finale. We have a whole episode on series finales.
Yeah.
I think we make that stake. We make that case that All Good Things is the best of the finales. But I think the best thing about it is and I've talked about this before too, but the way that it achieves wrapping the show up, giving it some finality while not really giving it finality, because they're going on to make movies and Generations is just a few months away, so they can't really do anything too final. They have to have the episode end in a sort of similar place that all of the episodes have ended, continuing to fly off on the ship, and they're going to go off to another adventure. So that's sort of a challenge that a lot of the other shows didn't have to didn't have to contend with. You know, TOS is obviously its own thing, and Star Trek 6 is its real finale, but DS9, Voyager, Enterprise even, you know, had the opportunity to sort of be a final ending. And to mixed results, obviously, some of those finales are better than others, but they all had the benefit of being able to do things that were final, and that kind of gives, you know, whether you're successful or not, at least it gives the finale a final element. It gives it a wrap up, and that's what kind of differentiates it from other episodes where TNG had to contend with wrapping it up in a satisfying way without really wrapping it up. And I think the way that they introduced so much scale into it with the time jumps and going back to Encounter at Farpoint and pre-Encounter at Farpoint, they're doing prequel stuff in addition to way out into the future stuff that may factor into this new show that's coming, you know, where we're going to see Picard 25 years later or whatever. And, you know, we got little glimpses of what an alternate future might look like, or a possible future might look like with the characters. And we're still in the present as well. And we're getting a new adventure, and the crew's got to solve a problem in a more traditional sense too. Like all three of these things are happening at once. And that kind of gives the episode this big sense of scale and excitement and, you know, different stuff that is kind of substituting for ending it. You know, we're giving characters endings, we're sending people off to do different things and ending people's arcs. So I think that's an amazing thing that the show sort of accomplished with its finale, and what we're going to talk about more specifically with the way it ties into Encounter at Farpoint, specifically with the Q narrative and the trial and what it's all kind of meant all along, is a big success, I think.
Yeah.
What do you think, having just watched All Good Things?
Yeah. Before we get into that, the context and how it kind of relates to the kind of rest of the show, I loved All Good Things. Again, really big stakes, like you said, with the grand scale, and I like that we don't really initially know that it's Q for a little bit. We see him, you know, jumping from different times and having to kind of explore that. Again, it's such a bold move to go back to the Q well when we have before in the series, to go back to the kind of time concept which they've done before. But I think they did it so perfectly that it doesn't seem, you know, too much or over the top or anything like that. I think it's perfectly balanced between this fun sci-fi concept, but also relating back to the past 7 years. So it's perfect.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. I think it's perfect too.
Does having this bookend in All Good Things add context to not just the rest of the kind of Q episodes that we've seen, but the whole show in itself?
I think it does, because, you know, it sort of works on two different levels. I think, while I don't think Q is really interested in, like, the crew doing the right thing, making the right moral choices, fighting for the right things, making the right choices, I think he's interested in more big picture, like Picard being able to think outside. The way he kind of frames it at the end of the episode is Picard solving this mystery by being able to, you know, figure out that time is sort of a fluid thing, and that that the anomaly is kind of coming from the future and working its way back. Like Picard's ability to sort of solve this cosmic problem is what kind of ends the trials, the way that Q says it, at least. Picard's ability and humanity's ability to kind of operate on that level is what Q is interested in, but what Picard's really defending humanity for in Encounter at Farpoint is the morality, the we're going to do the right thing, we're out here for good, we're not the way we were before. That's to me, like, as somebody in the audience watching the show, that's what I'm looking for in what Picard's talking about in Encounter at Farpoint. And I guess what I'm trying to say is the most impressive thing about it is it sort of conveys this message of what's really important, is because in Encounter at Farpoint, Picard knows he's being watched. He knows that he's being judged. Q's, you know, invisibly not always present, but is undoubtedly watching every move they make, every decision that they make. They're under the microscope the entire time. What's really important, and what really says that you've moved on and that you're better, is what how you behave, how you make decisions, how you do things when you're not under the microscope, when you're
Yes.
not being watched for every move that you make, and by bringing back this trial element that Q's been watching the whole time, the trial never ends. They're continually being watched and continually sort of defending themselves, if not formally and in a courtroom setting, but by their actions defending themselves and defending they're justifying their ability to do what they want to do by exploring and continuing to push forward and continue to evolve. The fact that when all these things that Picard and crew have done over the course of the 7 years has been justifying every day their continuing evolution and their continuing presence in the galaxy. That to me is a powerful thing that is kind of inherently baked into the Star Trek premise, and certainly the TNG premise of selling. We've gotten better. We're moving on, and it's not just when we're being watched by Q. It's day in and day out. When Picard is defending Data and Lal in the Offspring, and he stands up to the Admiral and says, "Not on my ship." We're not doing this. When he makes moral decisions like that, he's not being watched and judged for it in any way he knows of. But he's still continuing to do the right thing for the right reasons, and that's sort of the hallmark of the Next Generation for me. That's what I look for in the Next Generation. It's good people making good decisions for good reasons, and the way that trial defending humanity's progress and that they're pointed in the right direction and they have justified their existence and in this in the galaxy and in having a position of influence going around and involving itself in all these people, all these species is justified by those actions. I love that.
Mm-hmm.
That it uses that bracketing structure to convey it.
Yeah, I think that in Counter at Farpoint, they talk the talk. They talk all this big game, like we've we've evolved out of that primitive thinking and stuff like that, and now they got to walk the walk through all the 7 seasons, countless episodes, countless times of being, put their morality to the test and stuff like that, and they show it in this final episode. So I think that's awesome that they do that. So, and I think that even looking back at the previous previous shows and episodes, it definitely adds context to not just the Q episodes for better or for worse, but all the episodes, like you said, and you could pick out X number of episodes where you think that maybe was Q watching there. It's they didn't know they were being watched, that the stakes might not have been as high, but they still made the right decision. So
it reminds me that by doing what they did and bringing Q back and basically having him say, "I've been watching the whole time. The trial has never, the trial never ends. It's continuing. It's ongoing."
Yeah.
It reminds me that I'm worse as the audience. We're sort of the proxy for Q. We've been watching, we're watching them do these things, and we're making sure that they're sort of making the right decisions and staying on the right track. So I can imagine Q watching because I know I've been watching, that's I like that. I like that, and like I said, I think my favorite thing about it is while Q has been popping in and out for these usually fun little asides.
Yeah.
It's not something that has ever been. It's not something he's continually referenced every time he comes back. He's not telling him you're I'm coming back because you're continually on trial. I'm making sure that you're staying on the right track, and the trial really didn't end. The fact that that's not something that they hammered home for 7 years, and every year back in the courtroom, having the same old argument over again. I think the fact that it wasn't that makes it better. That gives it its power, that it's been kind of subtly in the background, and it's I think that was the right move to not continually go back to that idea.
I think of Drumhead. I think that maybe Q was in the audience just watching.
Sure, absolutely.
Especially when I think back to episodes like that, I'm thinking like, man, he's watching, but they still uphold to kind of what they were saying from the very beginning, and I think that's
They,
awesome.
and I think that's the key. Like, Q. I really don't think Q is interested in the face value of like the correct, in humanity's sense, like moral decision. I think the key to it really is that they're doing what they said they were going to do. Like
Yeah,
what Picard was saying in Encounter Apartment when he's standing in front of Q in the trial. This is what we are. This is how we operate. This is who we are, and this is who we're going to continue to be. We've evolved into this. We're going to keep moving forward. He's the episodes like the Drumhead and the Offspring, and pick your poison
yeah,
along
exactly.
the way. Um, the Wounded, all these things that pop up, Picard and crew, but specifically Picard, because Picard is the proxy
Yeah,
for humanity, and Encounter Farpoint is put in these impossible decisions, in these impossible positions of having to make the right moral call. Uh, it's the fact that Picard hasn't gone back on his word, and I think maybe Picard could become a caricature in some ways as like the always pointed in the right direction moral compass. Like he's goody two shoes kind of character who never makes the wrong decision. You could, I guess, come down on that side if you wanted to, but this framing device, I think, gives that idea power that Picard doesn't waver. He stays pointed in the right direction, and that's what gives the show its power, because he is doing what he said he was going to do. He's delivering on his promise in Encounter Farpoint the whole 7 years. And at the end of All Good Things, he's kind of maybe a little bit rewarded for it. I don't know that, like, Q kind of, my memory of Encounter of All Good Things, Q doesn't necessarily, Q helps Picard kind of a little bit
he gives them a nudge.
to get
Yeah,
there. Gives them a little nudge, and
yeah,
gives them a little, kind of keeps him pointing in the right direction. If Picard doesn't stay true for the 7 years, and he hasn't earned Q's respect for doing that, for staying on
Q wouldn't
task,
have
maybe he
gave
doesn't
the.
do
Yeah,
it.
exactly,
Right.
exactly.
Yeah. And these are all these little headcanon things in my head that aren't like on screen in any kind of explicit way. They're not telling us these things, but having watched The Next Generation over and over again and spent a lot of time thinking about it and thinking about how these bookend episodes build on each other. These are the kinds of things that it gives me to think about, which I love, and I think it's different and unique to TNG because of how specific it is.
Yeah.
And like a lot of people would say that like Nine and Voyager especially maybe have more refined specific premises than the Next Generation does, because Deep Space Nine is stuck in one place. They're continuing to kind of fight the same battles with the Cardassians and the Bajorans, and there's these common elements that are constantly there. Voyager's an obvious one with getting home. These
Yeah.
there are shows that have fairly easy log lines to say this is what the show is about. TNG is a little harder to define. It's more sprawling. It's bouncing around from episode to episode. It does all these different things. But if you look for it and you take the bookending thing into account and you kind of buy into what I'm saying, that's what TNG is about. It's about doing the right thing when you're not being
Watched.
watched.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Will we see? Will Picard take the stand in his new show? Do you think?
I don't know. I wouldn't be opposed by any means. I think it would be kind of cool to see Q again, and to drive this home even further somehow. Because I think it's not only it's not just the defining trait for the Next Generation as a show. I think it's one of the defining traits for Picard. He is humanity's proxy. He like I've always said, he's my favorite character in fiction because he, in my mind, is like the perfect human. He does the right things for the right reasons and is the person I want to be. That's in the DNA of the character because of being the proxy for humanity. He's chosen as the you're going to stand in and defend what humanity should be. So I'd love to see it bring that back. I don't know. Do you want to see it? Do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to see it. Maybe, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I would not be opposed. I think that, again, like you said, it is part of the character.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to maybe see how it's changed,
Mm-hmm.
as how that relationship's maybe changed, or what's changed with Picard. Um, so yeah, I think if we don't see it, there might be a mention of it,
Could be, yeah.
possibly. I think at least that. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so, but yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
I'll be interested. I could see it going either way. I could see it being an easy thing to back because it is such a defining trait of the Picard character, the relationship with Q. It is such a defining trait of the Next Generation because of that book ending. It's in the beginning, it's in the end, and it's all the way through the middle here and there. Like Q's a staple of that show. Uh, but I could see them wanting to bring it back for those reasons because it's an easy thing to draw on and it's something everybody kind of knows. Even if you're passively aware of the Next Generation, you probably know who Q is.
yeah.
Uh, but I could see them making the decision that's TNG's arc. Like that's what makes TNG unique, and that's their story.
Right.
And leaving it behind might make some sense in their minds too. But I guess it all depends on the kind of story they're telling and if there's room
Mm-hmm.
for something like that to breathe. But
Yeah.
like you said, I certainly wouldn't be surprised to hear, some sort of throwaway dialogue mention of Q. I'm certainly interested to know if because we only see Picard in little spur in the movies, basically little episodes, over the course of years after All Good Things. Was All Good Things the last time Q ever popped in on Picard? I mean, like to think not that there are other encounters that have happened in the 20 years since All Good Things. I don't know. Beautiful thing about this show is that everything's kind of on the table. They can do whatever they want because
Yep.
it's not a prequel. They have a blank whiteboard that
I could do
sort of has
go
no
any direction.
limitations.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
Um, would you recommend this kind of bookend strategy for any of the future shows, or do you think that kind of how TNG and the whole show was kind of set up and kind of played out? Do you think that's where this kind of storytelling tool that they used can be successful? Like maybe, maybe in a future show, or maybe to end Discovery, are they gonna bring back, I don't know, Red
Mm-hmm.
Angel, or do you think this could be successful in other shows, not just TNG?
I think it can be, but I think you have to. I think you have to do it with as much tact as TNG did for it to be as satisfying as TNG was. With,
Right.
uh, it's the key is to not be clumsy about it. I think, like I said, I don't think the book ending thing would have worked as well if every time we saw Q, it was reminding us, "Hey, we're on trial
Right.
still." Like I don't know that it would have been as satisfying if it wasn't executed the way it was throughout the show. And I think the beauty of it is that it was probably sort of a happy accident. The people who wrote Encounter Farpoint, like I said, weren't there. I don't think the people who were writing these Q episodes in seasons 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7
Weren't there.
were thinking about like, oh, we got to remember this trial thing. We're going to bring that back.
Yeah.
That's something that was done by somebody else a couple of years ago, 3, 4 years ago, and kind of left it behind. But
Right.
when they were coming to the end of the show and needed something to do and needed like I said, something that's not really final, but sort of puts an explanation point on the show.
Mm-hmm.
My suspicion is that they sort of backed into it, like it's something that they thought of, but it's not something that was on their plate throughout the show when they were writing it. I doubt that it was something that was heavily planned, which sometimes leads to the most success. So I think the way that the satisfying nature of the way TNG did it is kind of unique. But I think it's always a good idea to have some element of a bookend, because what a bookend really is it's paying off something that you got at the very beginning,
Right.
and it's telegraphing or it's putting an explanation point on the arc of the show. So and like I said, DS9 and TNG, DS9 and Voyager, some degree of that, but I think they're different. Like I said, they're more. The bookending nature of those shows are more baked into the premise of the shows that have been kind of on the forefront and obvious all the way through.
Mm-hmm.
Cisco going to the prophets at the end of What You Leave Behind and kind of accepting his fate, and that's been like a long building arc for that character, kind of slowly coming to terms with sort of his role in the universe, and his relationship with the wormhole aliens or the prophets, however you want to look at it. That's something that's sort of been there the whole time, and the paying off of the war, and the different little character beats all through it are very, very obvious. And Voyager clearly is an obvious payoff. So I think all the shows have up to this point have had some element of it, and I suspect Discovery and Picard and Section 31 and everything else we have coming down the pike will have something in them. It would just be kind of cool if they were as clever and unexpected as the way TNG handled it.
Yeah, I agree. Do you have any kind of final thoughts or anything you want to get across before we move into maybe the Trek Lab Spotlight for content stuff?
I would just recommend if you're working your way through TNG to try something different, especially if you watch it over the course of a long period of time. Once you get to all good things, pop Encounter 4.0 in first, watch them back to back, and like have that trial element like in your face because you just watched Encounter 4.0. I know I've certainly done that from time to time, and I think it kind of helps to maybe drive it home a little bit, and maybe gives it a little bit of a different flavor if you've done it a couple times before, and you want to try something different. I think that's a cool way to do it. But yeah, I just, like I said, I hope some of these new shows come up with a clever way to do it like TNG did.
Yeah,
it's pretty cool, and I think it sets TNG apart a little bit. And I think it's a big part of why their finale is so perfect.
Yeah, and maybe if you're doing the rewatch like Bill is, first of all, you should be following Bill because he has some great rankings and some great fun questions and stuff. But second of all, look at it as if you were Q looking at the crew and at Picard. I think it would be kind of a fun and maybe a different way to kind of look at TNG to maybe freshen it up a little bit if this is maybe your 18th time. Bill.
Yeah. Have the trial.
Yeah.
True. 18 might be shorting it.
Yeah.
In my life. But like have the trial in the back of your mind when you're watching it.
Yeah.
Put yourself in Q's shoes. Absolutely. Like Dan said, I think that gives it a different flavor. Gives it a new wrinkle if it is your upteenth time watching the show. I think that's a fun way to keep that bookending thing alive as you're going through it. And don't let it just be what the show is at face value. Like everybody knows that Star Trek's about these kinds of ideas. That's the premise of the show, and that's what makes Star Trek and different from other things. But embrace it as a part of the plot and a part of the day-to-day grind of the show. Is that it's selling this idea that you got to live it. You can't just preach it. You got to put it into practice.
Yep.
Make it a part of who you are.
Yeah. That being said, do you have any Star Trek content that you want to kind of highlight? Or I know this was kind of a big week for Star Trek podcasts and then non-Star Trek podcasts, if you want to talk about it. Go off script if you catch my drift.
I'm trying to remember. You go first. What's the big one that you want to talk about? I'm assuming you've listened to.
There's two kind of big ones. The Ready Room, obviously. We don't get that as often as kind of Trek FM's other shows. But when you do, it kind of just makes up for it. And it brings you right back to some of the great episodes that have been on that show. And it reminds you how great it was and how great Trek FM is. And and then also Trek Ranks and Bill's kind of trying to get me onto these script writing kind of podcast that he's been kind of. It's a non-Trek kind of podcast, but I think it's okay to kind of maybe go to the film side of things
because
we have film lovers that follow the podcast as well, and it's something Bill and I are both passionate about. So I'll give him the floor to kind of fill that in.
Yeah, it's been around for a long time. It's kind of a discovery. Script Notes. It's John August, who has been around a long time, is one of the hosts. He's written a lot of Tim Burton stuff.
Yeah.
But he's a workman, like screenwriter who's been in the industry for a long time. And Craig Mazin, who is kind of similar, long time. He's done a lot of kind of schlocky horror kind of stuff. He did like polished work on a lot of the scary movie sequels and things like that. But he just wrote Chernobyl, which is like highly successful on HBO, and people are talking about it being like some of the best TV of all time. That's sort of like his big success, critically at least. But it's these two screenwriters talking about their life in the industry and their kind of daily grind and things they've learned and things they're trying to. It's the podcast is really geared toward people who want to be screenwriters. It's sort of a college course in screenwriting. But even if you're not an aspiring screenwriter, like I'm kind of not, it's not something that's on my plate. It's a really interesting look at the industry from a more day in the life, practical sort of angle. It's not a bird's eye view of it from somebody who's not really living it. It's people that are in it, doing it every day, and trying to make a living, talking about their adventures, kind of, and things they've learned and things they want to impart. Covering mistakes they made, and they have a lot of guests talking about this and that. And I would just encourage everybody to check it out. It's called Script Notes, and I don't think you'll be disappointed. But yeah, the Ready Room episode as well. Go back to Trek. It was really cool. Another Star Trek podcast I would, as a interesting aside that I don't hear a lot of talk of, is called Making It So. The hosts are Mike Mann, who is not related to me, but
one N or two,
and two N's, and Josh Bald, and it's an interview show. An interview show, people who worked behind the scenes on Star Trek over the years. They've had writers, they've had stunt people, they've had prop masters, they've had directors, all kinds of interesting production side of the spectrum, people on for like hour-long interviews, and they their careers and their perspective on working on Star Trek, and it's a different kind of show that I would encourage everybody to check out. It's very frank, it's very honest, and you'll learn a lot if you're interested in like the day-to-day production of Star Trek.
All right, that's been show 92. We'll be back next week. Talk about more Trek. I'm excited. You guys know the drill. The discussion doesn't have to stop here. Hop on over to Twitter. Follow Bill and I's rewatch. Not just rewatch stuff, but anything you want to talk about. Definitely don't hesitate to kind of start the conversation. Facebook. You guys know the drill. Facebook, Discord, Twitter, the big three. Yeah. You can find us on YouTube, obviously, and also in the podcast feed. We're going to start posting on that.
Yeah, sounds good. Appreciate everybody who's taking a minute to watch us or listen to us on the podcast.
Yep.
And we'd love to hear from you.
Yep.
About this or any other topic we've covered over the last few years.
See.